Russia is trying to deal with heavy losses, either ignoring or failing to realize the extent to which the war in Ukraine has damaged its army and its allies. In fact, the Ukrainians have been conducting an incredible offensive operation for about 3 weeks to make the Russians aware of this. These offensive operations by the Ukrainians are proceeding from 3 different directions. Firstly, the Zaporizhzhia offensive axis, where fierce clashes are still ongoing. Ukrainian forces have finally liberated Hain in this region, increasing the number of settlements cleared of Russians in Zaporizhzhia to 8. The second offensive axis of the Ukrainian army is the Crimean Peninsula, where 9 recent drone attacks have occurred. The target of these drone attacks in Crimea was the important port city of Sevastopol. The third and final axis of attack within the Ukrainians' grand offensive plans is the Donbas front line. The events here resemble trench clashes from World War II. Russia's biggest mistake lies in its tactical strategy in this region. As you may know, Vladimir Putin received support from 2 different military sources, especially in Donbas, apart from his own army. One of them is the Wagner Group mercenaries, and the other is the soldiers of Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. After Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin announced his decision to withdraw his forces from Bakhmut to the central front lines of the city, Chechen soldiers became much more active on the battlefield for Russia. Kadyrov continued to send his soldiers to their deaths one by one. For Putin, Chechen soldiers fighting for the Russian army had once again created a significant military presence. There has been increased traffic on the line stretching from Mariupol to Donetsk. In recent days, there have been indications that the pro-Russian Chechen presence, especially in Donetsk, has increased. Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov, Kadyrov's brother, was among those who went to the Donetsk front line. We are aware of this. Kadyrov sent his relatives and acquaintances to the Ukrainian front lines, but it was a big risk for Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov to go to the Donetsk region, which is one of the most active front lines, because it was known that Delimkhanov was a field commander in Mariupol, an area currently under Russian control. Additionally, Mariupol is a front line with much fewer clashes compared to Donetsk. Russian telegram channels reported that Delimkhanov and his entourage were inspecting the front line for possible use by Kremlin forces before a dam in this area was hit, while waiting for the arrival of a senior Russian general. However, just at that moment, the sound of a HIMARS rocket was heard around Delimkhanov. The Chechens, the Russian soldiers, and the officials conducting the investigation discovered that Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov, a member of the Duma and a longtime brother-in-law of Kadyrov, was hit by a long-range HIMARS artillery while leading a delegation visiting a prison in the Russian-controlled area of Ukraine's Donbas region. The devastating HIMARS attack succeeded in destroying 200 of Delimkhanov's soldiers. However, Delimkhanov, whom Kadyrov sees as his brother, managed to survive the attack with injuries. Oplatakuria Group, a partisan group opposing the pro-Putin regime currently in control of the Chechnya region, also confirmed that a Kadyrov unit of 200 soldiers was destroyed in a HIMARS attack on the same day. Initially, some news sources claimed that Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov was dead. Consequently, Ramzan Kadyrov asked Ukrainian intelligence to provide precise information about the attack's location and the positions involved. Kadyrov also announced that he would offer a generous reward to anyone who finds his brother-in-law, Delimkhanov. Hours after the attack, when news began to emerge that Delimkhanov was still alive, Ramzan Kadyrov shared another message reiterating his demands. The Chechen leader continued to ask Ukrainian intelligence for help in locating Delimkhanov. Kadyrov's pleas for assistance were loud and clear. For the first time since the beginning of the war, many pro-Russian information platforms criticized Delimkhanov, his bodyguard, and local security officials for being careless and underestimating the Ukrainian armed forces' ability to detect a stationary convoy in the open and strike it with a long-range attack. The Russians themselves had security deficiencies in this regard, as it is claimed that Delimkhanov was inspecting a region in Donetsk for the Russians. In other words, Vladimir Putin and the Russian officials responsible for the war couldn't even ensure the safety of Delimkhanov, one of their valuable assets and Kadyrov's close associate. However, the Russians tend to deny and shift blame to others to compensate for their own shortcomings. In a telegram post, Russian Lieutenant Colonel Roman Venuvidin accused Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group mercenaries, of leaking targeted information about Delimkhanov's plans and vehicle column. The Novotin claimed that Prigozhin leaked information about the convoy's travel route and passengers to Kiev as a personal attack on Kadyrov. Kadyrov and Prigozhin, both leaders of thousands of armed men who are not part of the Russian military's chain of command, have long been rivals while favoring Russian President Vladimir Putin. From this perspective, it seems likely that Prigozhin would attempt such an action. However, according to some claims, Putin is aware of everything, which is why the Russian leader wants to gradually neutralize both the Wagner Group and the Chechen command one by one. According to some analysts, Putin is considering using the private armies of Prigozhin and Kadyrov as insurance against a possible coup led by the Russian army. But for Putin to utilize two different military forces, both teams must not have officials who rebel or refuse to die. When this is the case, firstly, Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin's reputation is destroyed by using the Russian Ministry of Defense. Finally, Delimkonov, who is seen as Kadyrov's brother, is attempted to be excluded from the war. The claims that Russia's behind these actions do not sound unreasonable. Well, if Putin is following such a strategy, is Chechen leader Kadyrov aware of this? Following Putin's order that all members of the armed volunteer group sign contracts with the government by July 1st, Kadyrov publicly delivered his formal agreement in a widely publicized ceremony to allow members of his personal paramilitary group to sign individual contracts with the Kremlin. Based on Kadyrov's decision, it seems that the Chechen leader doesn't care if his troops are destroyed on Ukrainian soil, because even though the number of casualties among pro-Russian Chechen soldiers is increasing, Kadyrov's war policies appear to remain the same. On the other hand, Prigozhin informed his mercenaries that he would not order them to sign contracts with Russia. After this decision, there were concerns that the Wagner leader would succumb to the Ukrainian fighters. If we examine the war strategies followed by Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov and Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin, it seems that this idea makes sense. Prigozhin's decisions are much more logical than Kadyrov's because the Wagner leader believes that the large-scale offensive plans of the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia, Donbass, and Crimea will be much more successful in the coming days. Prigozhin even congratulated Kiev after the Ukrainians captured 8 villages on the Zaporizhia front. With this approach, the Wagner leader has made his stance clear. Prigozhin is doing the right thing because Russian leader Vladimir Putin has been sending his own soldiers and soldiers of his allies to their deaths without hesitation. It is worth mentioning that, in addition to Delimkonov, Major General Sergei Goryachev, one of the important commanders of the Russian army, was also targeted by Ukrainian attacks in Zaporizhia. However, Goryachev had less luck than Delimkonov as he was killed in Zaporizhia. Prigozhin, on the other hand, doesn't want his mercenaries to meet the same fate as Goryachev. The cause of the war between Ukraine and Russia is currently more critical than ever. We told you that until a few weeks ago, Ukrainian and Russian troops were fighting each other for supremacy on front lines such as Bakhmut, Mariinka, Soledar, and Volodar in the Donetsk region. But nowadays, the strategy of the war has changed, and the Ukrainians have been conducting an unbelievable war tactic on the critical front lines between the Donetsk region and the Zaporizhia Oblast for about a week. The aim of the Ukrainians in these areas is to seize the high hills and blockade the Russians as much as possible. For this purpose, the Ukrainians sent many of their special forces to the critical clashes arena between Donetsk and Zaporizhia. The Russians were seriously surprised when the Ukrainians turned to the Donetsk-Zaporizhia axis instead of conducting an offensive operation on Bakhmut or another eastern front line. Currently, it is seen that the Russian troops are more on the defensive in this strategic area and are waiting for a move from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians who started to dominate the high hills are slowly starting to take control of the region. Let's dive into this critical period now and discover together how the Ukrainians changed the course of the war in the Donetsk-Zaporizhia direction. The latest reports suggest that the Ukrainians finally pushed the Russians out of Lavardin and entered new tactical heights, pushing towards Prytini. As you can see, the Russian forces in Nova, Vasilivka, and Nikopol are now at risk of encirclement and will most likely abandon their positions. This news clearly paints the collapse of the Russian defense. And this is a very painful blow to the Russian defense because here, as you remember, the Russians had the strongest fortifications that the Ukrainians could not pass in the first series of attacks. Russia made some moves to prevent progress here in a desperate attempt to slow the Ukrainian advance. Russian forces blew up a dam south of Staromalinivka. By draining the reservoir, water levels in the plains will rise, preventing the Ukrainians from rapidly moving their forces between the east and west banks of the river. Such an action is also a very strong sign that the Russians have abandoned Urigan, as this is the only settlement in the region on the east bank. And because of the flooding, the Russians could not make additional reinforcements or withdraw. In other words, this move of the Russians is not enough to prevent the advance of the Ukrainian armed forces. So the Ukrainians are testing new lines of attack to further expand the bridgehead and significantly increase the scale of their operations. Russian sources reported that the Ukrainians conducted a series of reconnaissance operations in force near Novodonetsk and Novomayorsk. This is another indication that the Ukrainians took Urigan, because such attacks will help the Ukrainians to equalize the front line precisely as this settlement level at the moment. Offensive actions are underway, and if everything goes according to Kiev's grand offensive plan, we can expect the collapse of the Russian River Peel-Starobilsk tactical group in the area to the west of Urigan, currently in the process of the operation launched by the Ukrainians to seize the high hills. The settlement of Novoazovsk has already collapsed. Ukrainian forces captured this area. The settlement of Novo-Novodivivo lies to the west of Revengeful. Therefore, the Ukrainian capture of Novogeorgivsk puts the revengeful Staromansky Russian line in even greater danger. Now this Russian line is completely blockaded by Ukrainian attacks from Novokiyevka in the west and Urigan in the southeast. The collapse of the Riverpol-Staromansky Russian line will strengthen offensive operations in this direction, as the Ukrainians have already captured 1111 settlement is located on the southwest side of Novogeorgiyevka. In other words, Ukrainians will be able to exert pressure from the western part of this defensive line that is from both Livny and Novokiyevka in order to collapse the Horivnia-Staromayorsk Russian line. In addition, this way the Ukrainians will be able to create a very wide attack network to seize the city of Staromayorsk southeast of Novogeorgiyevka. Capturing Starobilsk will be much easier as Urigan is already in Ukrainian hands because the distance between this city is about 2.5 kilometers. So both cities are very close to each other. Kiev will likely continue the operational process in this critical attack circle with the joint work of a combined unit of the Zaporizhia Separate Territory. Real Defense Brigade. This brigade is the military unit that captured Nova. For this reason, the Ukrainians can easily capture Staromansky by driving the soldiers of this brigade to the southeast of Novogerayevo. In the following time period, because the Ukrainian forces dominate the high hills in the areas up to Staromansky, it is known that at present the advance of this Ukrainian brigade continues. It is reported that the Ukrainian Marine Corps, who recently liberated the village of Storojivoy in the Donetsk region, eliminated 50 Russian soldiers and captured 4 more soldiers of Ukraine's Zaporizhia Separate Territorial Defense Brigade, are so well dispersed in these critical clashes that they can even intervene in Storojivoy, north of Stromykh. In summary, the Russians have a very difficult job in the clashes between Zaporizhia and the Donetsk region. As we have mentioned, the Ukrainian army, in addition to having captured the high hills in these critical areas, has placed its forces in such strategic positions that just like the domino effect, the settlements under Russian occupation in this critical area are under the control of Kiev one by one. Russia, on the other hand, seems quite helpless in this regard. This is because the Russians still have no plans of retaliation against the unbelievable attack corridor that the Ukrainians have set up between Zaporizhia and Donetsk. At the moment, the Ukrainians are playing, and the Russians are content with watching the moves of Kiev. But the Russians could not stand the pressure of the Ukrainians on the front lines between Donetsk and Zaporizhia for a long time. Despite all this, the Russians are unwilling to do nothing against the advance of the Ukrainians on the Zaporizhia and other southern front lines. Therefore, Moscow urgently took action. The Russian army has begun transferring its most combat-capable troops from the Kherson region in southern Ukraine to meet the incipient Ukrainian counter-offensive operations along the 800-mile front. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Malia shared critical statements on the official Telegram channel about this move of the Russians. Hanna Malia noted that the Russians' redeployment, the collapse of the Novokakhovka Dam, and the ensuing regional flood were a deliberate effort by Moscow's Ukrainian forces to thwart counter-offensive operations on the Zaporizhia and other southern fronts. According to available information, it has been learned that the Russian army has shifted its most capable units to fight from the direction of Kursk.